this is sort of an intermediate event that is hopefully sort of a pep rally for Earth Day, or whatever you want to look at it. Okay. So one thing, I've been involved in sustainability for many years at URI, and so have many other people, including those around here. But what happened is, they all have been in their own silos, as we call them, or their own corners of the campus, and usually there hasn't been much interaction. So one of the things that we're trying to do here is bringing together people from different colleges, different departments, different points of view, and of course also different students from different classes. So we have communication, art, engineering, etc. So in order to generate this cross-fertilization and to make change, or to introduce change into a sustainable, and making URI into a sustainable campus. What we will do today is we have 4 speakers, but we also want to create a record of ideas that are spawned by this event. And one motivation is we will have a time capsule. There's a Martin Carl, who's our visiting artist, is working on a time capsule which will be buried on Earth Day. And the idea is to include sort of the current state of the art as far as not just sustainability, but primarily that. So we're trying to capture some of these ideas.
So for those who don't know me, I'm David Abedon. I'm in the National Resources Science Department. I coordinate or direct the University of Rhode Island's interdepartmental minor in international development. I have over the years, for better or worse, been working in the environmental field, doing education occasionally, doing field projects with wildlife and biodiversity in the tropics and also in the Mediterranean. And also have been involved with, with regulation and adjudication of coastal management issues in Rhode Island, mainly in Rhode Island. So I had a kind of an opportunity to do a little academic stuff, do a little teaching stuff, do some research, and also to do some actual decision-making that affects quite a number of people. I thought I would talk a little bit about the daunting challenge I think that faces us environmentally, just briefly, and then talk a little bit about what the world is trying to do as of this coming September in terms of setting an agenda that will be called the Sustainable Development Goals. So here's a quote for you. You ready? One thing is sure, the earth is more cultivated and developed now than ever before. There is more farming, but fewer forests. Swamps are drying up and cities are springing up on an unprecedented scale. We have become a burden to our planet. Resources are becoming scarce, and soon nature will no longer be able to satisfy our needs. And that was by a guy named Quintus Septimus Tertullianus in 200 BC. How are we doing, folks? There's a book that's really been strikingly interesting to me. It's called The Conundrum, and the subtitle is How Scientific Innovation, Increased Efficiency, and Good Intentions Can Make Our Energy and Climate Problems Worse. Not better, worse. And to get a little handle on the scope of the problem, I'm going to read you a little story. I'm kind of, I got 7 grandchildren. I like reading stories now. You ready for this? The human race, Saul Griffiths has estimated, currently consumes energy at an average rate of approximately 16 trillion watts, or 16 terawatts, the equivalent of 160 billion 100-watt light bulbs burning all the time, capping atmospheric greenhouse gas at 450 parts per million, a level that's 15% higher than today, and that climatologists hope may be consistent with a global temperature increase of only about 2 degrees Celsius, would necessitate freezing global energy consumption at the current levels, despite a projected worldwide population increase by mid-century, that's 2050, of roughly 2 billion more people, or more than 6 times the current population of the United States. and replacing all but 3 of those 16 terawatts with energy created from a combination of the most promising renewable and non-carbon-based sources, such as photovoltaics, solar thermal, wind, biofuels, geothermal, nuclear fission. And doing that, it is said, would require, listen to this, building the following, building an equivalent of all of the following: 100 square meters of new solar cells, 50 square meters of new solar thermal reactors, and 1 Olympic swimming pool's volume of genetically engineered algae for biofuels every second for the next 25 years. 1 300-foot diameter wind turbine every 5 minutes. 100 megawatt geothermal powered steam turbine every 8 hours. And 1 3 gigawatt nuclear power plant every week. Such a program, is said, is at least theoretically achievable, but the practicalities are daunting. What do you think, huh? This is a great little book. It's easy for wealthy people to look busy on energy, climate, and the environment. All we have to do is drive a hybrid, eat local foods. Remember to unplug our cell phone chargers and divide our trash into 2 piles. What's proven impossible so far is to commit to taking steps that would actually make a large, permanent difference on a global scale. And then he says, just to make you feel happy, nevertheless, individual acts are insufficient. Just because everyone's doing a little good isn't going to make a difference in what this guy describes. Want to read this book? Not that. New Yorker magazine writer David Owen. So on the flip side, Bill Gates wrote an article in The Economist a couple of years ago where he said, what we really need to do is focus on what do we want to do globally and how are we going to get it done. And the precursor to that were these things called the Millennium Development Goals. Has anyone ever heard of that? Millennium Development Goals? And they were set about, there were 8 Millennium Development Goals, and they're going to be sort of used up on 2015. And they were mostly about reducing poverty. And now they've promulgated 17 goals, and they're going to be called the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're more about building global prosperity and sustainability and peaceful and inclusive societies. Wow. And there are pros and cons. Many people think there are too many goals, so it's spread out too thin, or they're not measurable. Some people say it's going to cost too much. The poorer countries think it's going to be funded. How much funding would they need, you may ask? Well, they figure to fix all the infrastructure that they're talking about in the Sustainable Development Goals, it'll take $7 trillion a year. To reduce poverty, they figure $16 billion a year, which may be reasonable. They have, the Millennium Development Goals were successful. That was one of the goals they met right away, was reducing poverty, cutting it in half. The Millennium Development Goals reached them right away, but the argument there is that, well, cheapest, the poorest countries had so much to gain, and they had done so little, that they looked really good, okay? If you want to look at people who are opposed to foreign aid, international development schemes the way they are now, you may want to read Bill Easterly out of New York University. You may want to read Moyo, who wrote a book called Dead Aid, or Dr. McNutt, who wrote a book called Damned Nations. You know, this is highly speculative. On the other hand, they expect 193 countries to sign on and pledge that they will support the Millennium Development Goals as of September 19, 2015. So that's coming up. Stay tuned. So what are these 17 goals? How am I doing at time? I don't know. 17 goals. End poverty in all forms, everywhere. Ha! End hunger, achieve food security. 3, ensure healthy lives. 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality of education. I'm even shortening this here. 5, achieve gender equality, empower all women and girls. 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, which we just saw it's going to be impossible. 8, promote sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth. 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization. 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive. 12, ensure sustainable consumption. 13, take urgent action to combat climate change. There's a winner. I'm sorry, my editorials. 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans. 15, protect and restore terrestrial ecosystems. 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies. 17, strengthen the means of limitation. And revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. That's shorthand for find the money. Under each one of those goals, they have targets, 169 targets, which they propose to measure. And I just wanted to read you one of the targets. Give you an idea of what they're trying to measure, so they find it. This is in the article by The Economist called The Good, the Bad, and the Hideous. And goal 4.7, this is their target. This is what they want to measure. If any of you out there are into any kind of metrics, measurement, capacity stuff, tell me how you would do this. By 2030, ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. They've got some challenges in front of them. On the flip side, they're pretty sure that the 193 United Nations member countries will sign this in September. It may be revised slightly, but the idea, according to at least the optimistic Bill Gates, is that without goals, you get nowhere. Okay, that's what I'm talking about.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Foster from the Philosophy Department in the URI Honors Program. I'd like to thank Norman, to whom we don't say no, as well as Martin Kyle, who's been a wonderful and inspiring presence on campus for students, faculty, and also those of us who are interested in engaging aesthetics and the humanities, and also my co-panelists. I'm honored to speak together. These are very distinguished people who've accomplished a lot in the area of sustainability, how people change, what we owe to people who have food insecurity. I, by contrast, am a mere philosopher and a humanist. And sometimes I work in and among the arts, what we call aesthetics, right? Aesthesis of the senses, the ancient Greeks said. So what can a philosopher have to say about sustainability? Well, we can approach it a few different ways. One way is to parse out the term, sustainability. Well, when chemists say sustainability, they mean this. When political scientists say sustainability, they mean that. We could do that. We could do philosophy of language, but that would be pretty dull. Another thing we could do is ethics, which is to say, ought we to aim at sustainable goals? What should we do to become a more sustainable society, both globally, locally, and in between? But instead, I was asked today to speak about culture. And one of my areas of research is aesthetics and environmental aesthetics. And so when Martin put this panel together, the driving question was, what can be changed? Which for some reason is missing from there. So I decided that what I would do is share with you the question, what can be changed? How can I change? Because about 3.5 years ago, I spoke to the Sustainability Fellows with Marcia and some of the others in this room. And one of the things I talked about were how we approach sustainability from a variety of viewpoints. So at that time, and Marcia, for some reason this is cutting off everything, you know? Well, while we work on that, up there it says environment, economic development, and that one there says ethics and justice. At the time, these were the 3 E's that the conference was organized around. What can we do to achieve sustainability across disciplines and across fields? Okay, we have a technical difficulty. Oh, yeah, can you guys see that? Here. The projector. It's right there on the laptop. It's like, yeah. All right, you know what? We're gonna wing it. We'll see topless slides. How's that? Topless slides today. So at that time, during this conference, one of the things I talked about in aesthetics, or the study of how we experience things through the senses, is the difference between narrative connections to things and ambient connections. So narrative connections are things that rely upon, in that top bubble, what that says is myth, stories, narratives. What means something to us as a culture? What do we value? What do we work to preserve? What do we not want to lose? We also look at historical institutions, social institutions. We say, how have people dwelled here? What is the history of this place? And then finally, another way is the narrative of science. What does the landscape show us about the ecosystem over time in this place? What about geomorphology? What data do we have about the rate of change and what will happen if we don't meet our goals? So these are the different disciplinary narratives that come at the idea of sustainability through telling stories. And some of those stories are mythical and fictional. Some of them are social scientific through history or sociology. And others are scientific narratives or stories. They're a progression of information by which we come to understand a place. But there's a different avenue to meaning and sustainability, and which I discussed 3.5 years ago, called ambient connections. So on the one hand, when we come together today in a place to talk about sustainability and what we ought to do to meet our goals, we're often driven by data and science and what we can project outward on the basis of fact. And that's a virtuous thing, that's a good thing. But do you think everybody listens to facts and then runs out and changes their behavior? Professor Prochaska, do people just change immediately when they see rationally the way things are going? No, they do not, right? Right? We wouldn't be in so much trouble if people responded to the factual narrative of what's going on globally. And so sometimes what we need to do when we're thinking collectively about sustainability is approach change through ambient dimensions of awareness. So what's ambient? Ambient means that which is around, right? More diffuse, not so structured as a narrative, not so factual as science, but nevertheless, the way we approach things, and up at the top, the bubble you can't see says senses, the senses, through our sense experiences. I'm going to come back to that later. We also approach it through the arts, and one of the things that Dave mentioned was what role should culture play in promoting sustainability, one of the last goals. And throughout my career, I've been on and off involved with various artists and art forms in thinking about the relationship between environmental awareness and artistic activity. And then finally, there's the existential dimension of the ambient, which is, what is the meaning of life? Whoa, there's a lot of stars. This is a very high mountain. I am very puny. You know, the sense of the sublime. So there's our embodied sensual relationship to the environment. There's the artistic expressive sense of the ambient, but there's also the sort of existential sense of being a creature in a universe and what it all means. Those are all dimensions that the arts and humanities can tap into in attempting to bridge the gulf between what science and fact tells us about sustainability and thinking about behavioral change and why things become meaningful to people. So here's a little bit of a story, a narrative, about how some of my own work has been involved in constructing narratives of awareness. So many years ago, almost 20, I was invited to an international conference to speak on environmental aesthetics. And I decided to talk about David Thoreau's first trip to Katahdin. Has anyone ever been to Katahdin? Baxter State Park in Maine? Okay, right, nice edge. Yeah, I once crawled across it. It's very scary, but wonderful place for outdoors people. And I wanted to give a talk about how when David Thoreau, with all his Walden, peace, the woods, the first time he went to real wilderness, he freaked out. He did. And he wrote about it in his essay called Katahdin, in a book called The Maine Woods. And essentially, Thoreau went halfway up and was frightened down by some of what he saw overnight there. And from that point on, Thoreau's attitude toward nature was a little less romantic and a little more respectful of the non-human world and what we cannot engage with without frightening ourselves or being uncertain of whether we'll survive. So I wanted to give this talk. It was in Finland. They're really into environmental aesthetics there. They're very advanced. They integrate sustainability and design in public life. So I wanted some good photographs of Katahdin. And I called Baxter State Park and I said, oh, do you have any good photographs? He said, well, our photographer is Bill Siliker. Why don't you call him? Here's his number. So I called Bill. Now this is the days before the internet where I could just copy pictures and put them in. And I talked to Bill. Bill's this wonderful man, right? And he's published books on loons and moose. He's a nature photographer. So we get to talking, and he said, you know, if I give you these pictures, there's a problem. And I said, what's the problem, Bill? He said, if I show how beautiful Katahdin is, everyone's going to want to go there. But if everyone goes there, over time it won't be so beautiful. They'll leave their trash, they'll be there with their big RVs, even though you can't drive those into Baxter State Park. So he said there's this paradox. The beauty of the pictures will make more people go there, but the more people who go there, unless they behave sustainably, will impede the experience of stillness and beauty. So I finally talked him into giving me the pictures, but they came at a price. And the price was, Bill said, okay, I'm going to lend you these photos if you'll pay for the insurance. So he said, send me the slides, paid the insurance on the slides. He said, you need to give me something in return. I said, all right, what? He said, you're a philosopher, right? I said, yeah. He said, I belong to the North American Nature Photography Association. And I'm on the ethics committee, and we need to write a code of ethics, and I can't get anybody to agree on anything. I want you to come and join us and help us do this. And I said, okay. So that's how I became involved for many, many years with the North American Nature Photography Association. That's a little picture of one of our workshops out in the field, right, looking for owls. And that picture's pretty representative. It's mostly like, you know, middle-aged, well-heeled white guys, but you know, they're working on some diversity because it's all of our environment. And showing images of our world through a variety of lenses is important. So I joined NAMPA, and sure enough, I get involved for years. We write ethical field practices, which are still used today. And they guide the activity of people like Gary Grosh, who was the Smithsonian's first environmental photographer to document climate change over 5 years. Gary carries our principles with them, give them out. James Baylog, his project now, Chasing Ice, he goes all over the world showing how climate change is influencing the ice developments. And I'm really proud of this one. This is a photograph by Greg Kahn, a young photographer who 2 years ago was Small Market Photographer of the Year, and about a year and a half ago was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He came through NAMPA on their high school student program. He's from South Kingstown, and he's the son of Professor Len Kahn. Does anyone know Len Kahn in physics? Professor Kahn, great teacher of physics. Well, this is his son, who's and recently was named one of the top 50 environmental photographers in the world for his documenting climate change in the eastern shore of Maryland and in Italy. So Greg Kahn was one of the young people who came through our organization. So one of my narrative experiences was helping to write ethical field practices on how to behave sustainably in the environment, not wrecking the environment you're trying to depict in your photographs. And it had to do with approaching animals, the way blinds were set up, about noise, and certainly about rubbish. We also wrote digital captioning policies at a time when digital photography was beginning to replace film photography. So after that, I also became, this is kind of a bad slide, but Waterfire Providence. I became involved with Waterfire Providence to help write the narrative of why did this artwork mean so much to people. Has anyone been to Waterfire? Yeah? Okay. So one thing you might want to think about is I could write these little narratives of why it connects to the history of Providence. It caught on fire, it was rebuilt. Phoenix from the ashes, we took the highways off the rivers, everyone came down to the river, we look at the boats, right? But part of the reason Waterfire is appealing is its ambient sensibility. All kinds of people come out. It smells good, it sounds good. It appeals to our senses, it's contemplative, and yet it's communal. So I wrote for Waterfire, and I did. And on the right, that article's actually in Finnish, right? The Finns became very interested in Waterfire, so I went back to Finland, and we talked about the various reasons why Waterfire seems to continue to appeal to people as a work of art. So, but again, I'm writing narratives, right? I'm writing stories, I'm writing accounts, and that's pretty good. You know, it's okay. Although a friend of mine from high school came down to Waterfire, and one of my essays was in a magazine, and she brought it home and she showed it to her mother, and her mother said, I don't know what she's talking about, right? I'm gonna come back to that. Because I thought that essay I wrote was kind of poetic, and I thought it really honored Waterfire, but Mrs. Quinn didn't know what it meant. And that's gonna be part of what I emphasize here. No matter how much you know, if you can't communicate it, it's useless. And if we really want to get people on board with sustainability, we need to speak with each other, and speaking starts with listening, not with telling. Here's how you ought to act. Here's how you should see this. It begins by listening and observing people where they are and making connections within and around existing practices and cultures. I've had to learn that lesson the hard way. This is Old Man in the Mountain, and that's the cover of another book. I've also worked on ecological restoration issues and when we should and shouldn't restore degraded environments, drawing on science, history, and culture. And the Old Man in the Mountain in New Hampshire was something that was held up artificially for almost 100 years before the nose fell off a few year ago. But that was a work which we constantly restored to keep it up because of its cultural symbolism. And the question is, should we restore degraded environments? Well, here comes the part where I confess to making big mistakes. So some years later, I was asked to attend a conference at Harvard on ecological restoration. And so that conference ended up as a series of essays in this book, The Handbook of Regenerative, I can't say it, Regenerative Landscape Design by Robert Franz at Harvard. And among other things, I look at competing narratives of restoration. I look at the Estuarine Society's regulations, I look at the laws, I look at the nonprofit groups' ideals for restoration, and I show how they don't match up. Ooh, how impressive. And I go into many, many, many pages of detail. See? Look how long my article was, right? You can't see the numbers, but it was way long. I compared all the facts, and I show that we need to get our facts straight. And then I also look at a case study. Save the Bay has a program for kids called Seagrasses in Classes. And the kids plant eelgrass seeds in their little tanks, and then they watch them grow, and then they get transplanted to the bay, and then they'll care about ecological restoration, because Narragansett Bay used to have lots and lots of eelgrass, which is an important habitat for fisheries and other aquatic species. And a lot of it's been lost to disease and to human influence. And so Save the Bay is involved in restoring those habitats. And so I started to do a little case study of this program. Seagrasses in Classes. So the woman, the education officer for Save the Bay, calls me up. She said, Cheryl, I heard you writing about this. I have to tell you, it was a disaster. It was a complete failure. Seagrasses in Classes was really, really boring. Does anyone know anything about eelgrass? It grows really slowly. There's not a lot for the kids to be doing. And so when they were waiting for the little shoots to come up, they would look at fat shoots. It was a disaster. We had to close the program down. It just didn't work. So the question, why didn't it work? Right? Because if we want people to care about sustainability, we should work on the kids. Well, one reason it didn't work is it didn't appeal to any engaged, embodied sense of the environment. If you want kids to care about place, start from what they did as kids and do as kids and where they live in their bodies as kids. And so Save the Bay was implementing a newer program at that time, one that got out into the environment. And so that's Conrad de Bruin. Anyone have Professor de Bruin from French? So Conrad said to me, of course it's not working. You have to use your senses, right? She's very French. Senses. It was boring to look at those glass. They have to get out into the environment. They have to wade into the water. And sure enough, I began to rethink, because there's something I haven't told you. Save the Bay's program failed, but that book chapter I wrote that I researched to death, I was proud of that. Almost nobody reads it. Steve Olson, who runs the Coastal Resources Center, or did until recently, down at Bay Campus, tried to read it and said, Cheryl, it's so dense. And I'm like, I thought this was pretty good writing for the public. It was unreadably dense, and thus having very little impact. So this got me thinking, how am I spending my time? Who am I writing for? And how am I trying to communicate? So just as the seagrasses in classes was really boring, so my article was kind of boring too. It didn't really get people where they live. So I remembered when I was a kid, I used to hide in a bush in our yard when I didn't want to hang out with people, but my mother would lock us out of the house. She'd say, too much books isn't good, get out and play. So I would go outside and I would run in and I would hide in this big bush. And it was just a way to be alone, right? Because most of where I lived was developed and semi-urban and not very nice, but there was this bush I could hide in. It smelled good. And that was sort of a sanctuary, and it was really important to me existentially and sensorially. And those are my kids there out in the snow, because I lock them out of the house now and say, go play outside. Because I realized that even though at the time I wanted to stay in and geek out with my books, my mother was right to make me go outside. Because I developed a physical, sensorial, and memory-driven connection to my natural environment. And so I thought, that's what I need to harness. That's what I need to start to think about. How do we get people to think about us here? The way we live as embodied creatures in environments through which we create meaning, that we may want then to be motivated to preserve sustainably. This is that bad slide, let's get by that. So, a couple of other things, and I'll stop. Back early in my career, before I became a professor, I was an agent for a sculptor. This is Hideo Furuta. He was a Japanese stone carver and artist. He had an art degree from Hiroshima University, but he also lived in a quarry for 3 years learning traditional Japanese stonemasonry. He said, I want my work to be sustainable. He learned how to forge his own chisels. He did all his work by hand. He didn't use machinery, and he made these large-scale granite sculptures. Brilliant artist, and people would touch them and sit in them. You could see him peeking through one of them. And there was a real tactile sense of meaning with Hideo's work, and I liked that. And I was his agent because he could speak English well but couldn't write it well. And I would write proposals for him to get commissions. And during that time, I realized I was forced to use words in a way that connected to people's senses and meaning. And he got lots and lots of commissions and continued to have them right up until a couple of years ago, and unfortunately he died of cancer. He smoked a lot of cigarettes. And so this led to me writing a little bit from a different angle. Not so many boring facts, but talking about how tactility, how the world we experience through our skin invades memory and creates meaning in place. This is what Save the Bay was trying to do after seagrasses and classes failed. They were trying to forge sensorial, tactile connections between children and place, so that those connections would drive the motivation to sustain that environment. I also became involved with the Coastal Institute in an IGER project. We worked for 5 years to train young scientists how to communicate the implications of their work to the public. And because I had made so many mistakes in communicating my work to the public, we were able, Judith Swift and I and our other colleagues, to help young scientists figure out how to talk about sustainability in ways that were quick, transportable, and legible. And this is from the Coastal Institute website, Translate Science, Make It Understandable. Look at the picture they've used. How do you make it understandable? Those kids are going in the water. Right? That picture conveys so much about what the Coastal Institute is attempting to do. Forge connections through the senses to understand the facts of sustainability. And then for a couple of years, Karen, Professor De Bruin and I, Ian Reyes, Kate Morrison, we had a radio show called The Beauty Salon. And we did over 60 interviews with people from all around Rhode Island about how aesthetic engagement influenced their life. And most of our interviews were not with artists. They were with people who made fishing rods, people who grew sustainable beef. We talked to the sewage treatment people about how clean water matters and how we can sustain the recycling of waste to have enough water in our environment. This had more of an impact than all of my dense research. I'm not saying we don't do the research, but that research speaks to a very small audience. What artists and humanists can do is forge vectors by which to convey a sense of meaning about the science and facts through the senses, through history, and through existential meaning. Martin Heil. One of the things that the Reuse Project is doing is engaging people in reusing material for artistic and practical purposes, because art isn't just about display, it's about engagement. And one thing I'm inspired by in Martin's work is the work emerges from the community's own values, involvement, and inputs. Art is a process as much as a product, if not more so at times. And then finally, I'll leave you with this. Early in my career, when I first came to URI, I was very excited because there was a scholar here named Cynthia Hamilton. She had just been hired to run the African American Studies program. Ms. Hamilton was a pioneer in the 80s and 90s of what's called the environmental justice movement. She studied how polluting industries were located disproportionately in poor African American areas. Did anyone go to see Bobby Seale when he was here a few weeks ago? I did. Bobby Seale gave one of the best talks I've ever heard in my life. And I left that talk, and he too is concerned about environmental justice. One of the big challenges for sustainability studies is that it cannot be separated from the politics of place. And we have many, many problems with respect to pollution and where those industries are located, and not in my backyard. So where my work is going in the next phase is to return to my early interest in environmental racism and environmental justice, because we have to start somewhere. And as Bobby Seale says, it's too late by tomorrow. You have to start today. I don't know how I'll do it, but I'm refitting some of my courses with our new Gen Ed program to reorient some of my thinking toward those problems which we have right here in Rhode Island. And we can begin to examine the way equity and existential meaning intersect with respect to sustainability. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Kathleen Gorman, and I am a professor of psychology, as well as the director of the Feinstein Center for a Hunger-Free America here at the University of Rhode Island. I am going to be talking a little bit about sustainability from the, Cheryl talked about the 3 E's of the economy, the environment, and equity, I think was the 3rd E. So people use those different terms. My slides are going to say, when they come up, economy, ecology, and community, I think is what they say. So there's many different ways of thinking about it. And the community side is the equity or the social justice piece of this. And I approach this around the issues of food security. But again, the social equity piece can be thought about in all these different domains. And some of what I talk about will tie together nicely with the previous talks, and some will be completely unrelated, I think. So you can maybe make some connections. There we go, let's see. All right, so that's a little off. There is an environment up, an economy is up at the top, ecology, and as I said, community. And then, oh, bummer, it's not right.
It might be the purpose of it too, because I tested it out a second ago.
Okay, so you want me to turn this off and see if it, yeah, see if it comes back. So what's, so when you take those 3 systems and you overlap them, what comes together in the middle, that little intersection, is what we call community food security. So it's when the environment and the economy and the community come together. That intersection is okay, so it's not this? Okay.
Topless slides too.
Okay, so I have topless slides. So we'll see if I remember what's on the top. So anyway, that intersection is what we call community food security. And here's nicely, the definition does show up in terms of a vibrant, sustainable local food system that provides residents with equitable access to affordable, nutritious, healthy, safe, high quality, and culturally appropriate food. So that's kind of our goal. When we think about a real sustainable system, everyone should have access to food that they can purchase, that's nutritious, that's healthy, that's safe, and that is within their local community, right? when I was doing this talk, first preparing it, I think a lot about social justice, and I've had some interesting conversations with people about whether or not food is actually a right. And there are people who would say it isn't a right, and people who would say, well, it is a right, and is it a human right? And so it's an interesting philosophical discussion, right? And I'm walking across campus, and I see this on our campus, right on the corner of Fortin and Upper College Road. And what it says at the top, and so I'm kind of bummed out because you can't see it, is that chocolate drizzle is a right. And so I was like, I'm walking along and I see this, oh, this is perfect. I'm debating in my head, is food a right for people? And here I find out that chocolate drizzle is a right for all of us. Wow, cool, thanks. So now you know it is a right, right? That made me, I guess, feel better or be more concerned, right? And so when we think about the food system, this is a place where all of the different ideas around sustainability, I think, intersect. Because a food system involves, and you can start really anywhere, but we'll start with the resources, which include land and water and agriculture, and then we have production, processing, distribution, so all of those different areas, and then somehow that food gets shared with people through the outlets. And then we have consumption. I usually put eaters here. That's all of us. We're all eaters. And then waste reduction, which is all of the issues of recycling and management of resources to make sure that the system continues to survive. And when you think about this, one of the things about these arrows is that they're all there's sort of a flow and a movement. And if you think about how if you pulled one of those arrows out, there would be a lot of disequilibrium, right? There'd be an imbalance. And so to keep a sustainable system, we need to keep the balance moving. And one of the ways that, or one of the goals for this system to work is that we have food security. And this is the definition. There's a couple of different definitions, and I usually use a USDA definition of food security, but I was recently at a conference where they talked about this FAO definition, and I liked it even better. So they're very similar. So this just says that our goal is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods that meet their dietary needs, their food preferences for an active, healthy life. So that comprises a whole lot of components around individuals and communities and respect for all of their variable differences. So we think about not just the quantity of food, which when I got into this field, and I was just gonna, in the beginning, I was gonna tell you that I got into this field through developmental psychology, looking at the effects of malnutrition on children's cognitive and social development. And I did a lot of work internationally as well as in the US, and then have transitioned into more domestic hunger, food insecurity, and looking at the effects within the US as well. So I started internationally and then moved, which is sometimes different than the way people go in directions. So, but what this idea of food security represents is both physical, nutritional, health, cultural, psychological needs. All of those needs for individuals need to be respected in order to have food security. So you can't pick out a food and say everybody should eat this, and that's enough. You have to think about all of the other elements that would impact on that. And just to give you a little data, right now, these are the most recent data that we have, about somewhere between 14 and 15% of all households in the United States experience food insecurity. That's about 1 in every 7 households is food insecure. So that should be a shocking number. That should be something that you say that's just not okay. In Rhode Island, we're right around the national average, so you can either feel good about that or not so good about it. But and these numbers over here are complete convoluted estimates that because we don't have local numbers, I had to calculate using a lot of estimates. So they're just to give you some idea. We have this notion of with hunger, it's a more severe form of food insecurity. When people respond to this survey that is given nationally every year, and they respond affirmatively to a large number of items, they're classified as with hunger or very low food security. And these are typically people who are actually going without food for a day or so. So these are annual numbers. They're not people who are suffering from food insecurity every single day of their lives, but it's a recurrent event that happens maybe several times a month over the course of several months. Would be a household where some people in the household are not getting enough to eat, and there's a persistent concern and worry about not having food. And as many things that we've talked about today, it is not food security or food insecurity is not distributed equitably. As compared to 14.3% of all US households, we see elevated rates for households where children live. So if you just took all the households where there are children, you'd see about 20%, 1 in 5. If you took single parent households, so a mom and children and some dads and children, you'd have about 1 in 3, 34%. Actually, that's more than 1 in 3 almost. And then African American and Hispanic households and other ethnic and racial minorities also, but again, the data are smaller in percentages, so it's in numbers, so it's hard to get accurate percentages, but have elevated rates. So 26 and 24% roughly for Black and Hispanic households. So that's again 1 in 4. Good news, bad news is of senior citizens, we have a 9%. You might notice that that is the only statistic that's lower than the national average. So on the one hand, you might think 9% of all senior citizens live in a house without enough food. That's pretty sad. But you might also say, why are our elderly people doing so much better than the national average? And the short answer is likely Social Security. So many of them are protected from the most severe forms of hunger and food insecurity. There's just a little plug. So when people say, why have Social Security, here would be a reason to say, well, maybe it's working. And so when I was thinking about this, I wasn't thinking, I guess I'm thinking not about change as that I know how to change, but these are all the things that we need to change. And so it's about access. And I listed, this is not a conclusive list of factors, but I think it's an important list that covers, obviously, people who are food insecure lack money, they lack resources, they either lack jobs or they have jobs that pay low wages, both of which are very common nationally as well as in Rhode Island. We know from lots of research that healthier foods are more costly. We know that low-income populations both have difficulties in transportation, as well as communities offer various forms of transportation as well as access to stores. So low-income communities, and I think Cheryl was talking about this, have disadvantages in terms of pollution, in terms of environmental toxins, and also in terms of access to grocery stores and access to other resources. So it's a double-edged sword. The food deserts and the urban grocers have, if you go into certain grocery stores, they may have a lot of grocery stores, but they're not stores that sell necessarily the products that you would hope would be available. So fresh fruits and vegetables are much less likely to be available in urban or convenience stores than they might be in full-service markets, which will then have higher prices and be harder to access. So it's somewhat of a circular issue. And then quality. I was at a focus group with some people in Pawtucket not too long ago, and one of the women was talking about how hard it is to shop, and she actually said that she traveled by bus to a more distant grocery store than the lower price grocery store, I should say, in her neighborhood, because she said the quality of the food was just so much better. So she would travel further by bus in order to get fresher food. So it's kind of, again, a paradox there. And that's something that I think we don't talk about enough, is the whole idea of time and food preparation and convenience. We are a society that thrives on convenience, and yet for low-income people, they are really at a very big disadvantage in terms of convenience, and they have multiple jobs, very irregular hours, lots of challenges, and so we all make choices. I mean, I talk to my friends and they talk about the choices that they make because of juggling kids and schedules, and then to add on the lack of income and resources to do that is really remarkable. And so as I was saying when I showed the sustainability piece, that we need a balanced system. And so many times these 4 areas are out of balance. So I think when we think about sustainability and achieving our goals, we have to figure out how to get these things in sync. And sometimes they're contrary, or they contradict each other, I guess is the word. So We have the public health perspective where we want healthy foods, we want to reduce obesity, we want to promote healthier eating, nutrition-related killers, meaning that many of the, I think it's 4 out of the top 6 or top 10 reasons why causes of death are nutrition-related. So we want better educational outcomes. We want people to have jobs and to be productive, and then we have people who need services. So we have to think about all those different ways that come together and make sure that the balance is there. And that is an incredibly big challenge. And just to give you one concrete example, we have right now this huge paradox of hunger and obesity. And people say, some people say, why is obesity higher among low-income populations? And in fact, it isn't really. If you look at the statistics, it's higher among some low-income populations and some racial and ethnic groups. But there is I mean, basically, overweight and obesity is high among all populations. But here's some really interesting information about what happens when people don't have enough money to buy healthy food. They end up either buying more food, but that's less quality, or they end up trading between the same foods but lower quality foods or lower cost foods. We also know there's a lot of emotional response to undernutrition or being hungry, so we have an emotional stress response. We also know that there's cyclical eating that happens because people who get benefits tend to eat when they have resources, and then you hear very frequently that people over the course of the month have fewer resources and their diet changes. So they'll eat more low-cost foods, lower energy, or higher energy but lower nutritional quality. And then there's also physiological changes, so that, for example, among children who've been malnourished, as adults we know that they have more efficient ways of storing fat in their body. So, and some of you probably have seen this in when you diet, but the idea that the body actually responds to the absence of food in a way. It learns different mechanisms and different ways to store fat. So calories get stored as fat more efficiently in people who have had long-term, or certain periods of time where they've been undernourished or restricted diets. So that's just an example of that imbalance that happens, and you have to take into account. You can't just look at one side, like people should eat better. Well, yeah, but, or people should spend their money better. Well, maybe, you know. And so in response, I think we have a series of responses, and I just want to say before we go further, I don't agree with a lot of the things up here, but these are different responses that society, that individuals, and that groups have proposed to create a greater food security. I think some of these things are not ideal and actually harmful, but they're all different ways that society has responded to issues of food security. So everything from regulation to increasing certain types of services, to incentives, to regulating and other types of behaviors. So there's different approaches, and I don't know if Jim's going to talk about some things, but some of the things when we think about changing behavior, we do think about regulation and change and promoting versus restricting. So I was trying to give different examples of how those different types of behavior change might impact, and behavior not at an individual level necessarily, but at a community level, could impact the availability of foods, or the increased food security. We have farm subsidies, we have soda taxes, we have all different kinds of ways to think about how we're going to promote food security or address it. And then just to move one step further out into the global world, most of our policies are not restricted, or the ideas that we're talking about are not restricted to the US. So from an economic perspective, we have to think about the shift. There's been a wide shift to promoting foods that have high yield or high profits as opposed to nutritional quality. Again, I mentioned the top killers. We have a lot of abundance of foods that are not good for us. And foodborne illness is a very big problem. When it surges, when it surfaces every once in a while, everybody talks about it for a few weeks or months, and then it disappears and you don't hear about it until the next time it happens. We haven't had anything really recently, but oh, I didn't remember that. But there's always something that happens, and then everybody's talking about it, and then it dissipates. But I'm thinking there's something coming soon. So, and then the distortion of the global markets, the cheap food, and the loss of land. So we have even government agencies that ship food as opposed to promote agricultural practices, and therefore that has not only it has a negative impact on the production in the farming communities in those areas, because when food gets dropped into a country, the farmers then get taken out of business. And so instead of supporting local agriculture, we actually decrease it. When that's not the original goal, but that's one of the consequences, then we have to worry about energy and just, the food miles, how far food has to move from one place to the other, just so we get it. Next time you go to the grocery store and you buy something, look at where it came from, calculate those miles. It's pretty far. The environment, the pesticides, the erosion, the biodiversity, all of those issues certainly concern both the production and the consumption of food. Then we have food production, terminator seeds, controversies around genetically modified foods, and then the social piece, which again takes us back to the equity piece, and that there is that really important connection to food that we all, we love food. We have food today. You all ate, or I hope you ate. There's rarely an event that we don't associate. I always ask my students, so think of something, and I can name any event, and they can tell you what food they ate for that event. Food is cultural, it's meaningful. It's I think some of, it does nourish us, but that's one of the, I want to say the least important, especially to the nutritionists out there. But it's only a piece of what's so significant about food. It really defines our religious practices, it defines our values, our cultural practices. So much of what we do socially is attached to food. Some people might say that's a bad thing, but it really is an important. So this whole connection to food and how it unites us and shapes who we are is really something that I think we have to value and remember, as well as we're thinking about keeping the system in balance. And so this is just sort of a summary statement that equitable access to affordable, nutritious, healthy, safe, high quality, culturally appropriate, local food requires a balance between growers, producers, retailers, whose efforts need to be viable, and the consumer whose needs must be met. From the justice perspective, despite the additional restrictions placed on the consumer by the economy, the individual's personal role in selection and choice of food must be respected. So that ties it all together from my perspective of the social justice perspective within the sustainability model.
Thank you for organizing this. I'm very pleased to be part of a multidisciplinary group looking to find solutions for multidisciplinary problems like sustainability, and I will talk about health as well. When I met Mark, within one of my philosophies, and that is that art is the source of my inspiration and science is the source of my validation. And as Cindy was talking about, Cheryl, in terms of one of the things about art is it moves me sensually, it moves me emotionally, it moves me spiritually, and I have learned the hard way that I need to be as passionate about my science as I am about paintings and sculpture and architecture and my theater. I was raised to believe you have to be objective. I don't think I can be objective as a scientist. I don't think I need to be objective as a scientist. I believe science can be objective. I believe science needs to be objective. And I think we build in terms of our best work where our passions are. So let me start with this. Four behaviors account for about 70% of all chronic diseases and premature deaths in the U.S. Smoking, alcohol abuse, inadequate diets, inadequate physical activity. What is it about these four behaviors that makes them so important to our health and well-being? Well, think about it. What they share in common is they are fundamental processes of life. Breathing, drinking, eating, moving. And if we're breathing toxins, we're putting ourselves at risk. If we're drinking to toxic levels, we are. If we're eating toxic types of foods, and if we're not moving enough to take and remove those, we put ourselves at risk. Now, what drives us as human beings to most often engage in those kind of high-risk, unhealthy behaviors? Well, major studies numbers of years ago, household surveys found that when people are psychologically distressed, anxious, bored, angry, worried about their finances, that they smoke more cigarettes, drink more alcohol, eat more junk food, go back to the couch more. And so we add to that 4, we get a handful. The 5th one is feeling, okay? And when we are feeling distress, we are much more likely to take and go to these unhealthy kinds of behaviors. It's because, as I was saying, we are not wired to be primarily rational, empirical decision makers. That's an academy's ideal of human beings. And even within the academy, we really are much more affected by emotional kind of decision making. We talked about this in terms of at our department meeting. A recent article came out, Harvard School of Business. One organization spends 2 million hours a year doing performance ratings of their employees. Okay? And they showed this study coming out that showed that when you do performance ratings, about 60% of the variance is accounted by the rater's biases. Only about 20% are accounted for by the person's performance. And here we have a university that wastes so much time on performances and reviews that have ultimate payoff. They did a study and they found with all these hours, they could take and reduce the evaluation of their performance to 3 questions. Okay, to 3 questions. The point here is that when we are looking at solving a solution, typically you find there's a small number of variables that can account for most of the variance. And those are the strong variables that you want to be investing in. And so like with health and well-being, we have a handful, 5. Contrast that with the thousands of genes, the thousands of germs, the kind of profound impact we can have by concentrating our resources on the variables that make the most difference. So one of the things we should be struggling with in the area of sustainability is, at least at the individual level, what are the behaviors that account for the most variance? And to find and see where can we get a consensus on that. Because you can go in all kinds of directions, and there's many more behaviors. I mean, our model has been applied to almost 50 different behaviors by Velvet in like 10 different countries, but they don't have the same weight. So let's start with the possibility, okay? The classic 3 R's at the individual level. How much of sustainability can they affect? And so we talk about renewal, right, or recycling. We talk about replacing with high energy, with lower energy kinds of alternatives. And we talk about reducing. Okay? Now, my own guess is, and this is naive because that's not my area of expertise, my own guess is that a matter of reducing our consumptive behavior is probably the most important one. Okay? I just read that we have in the United States 2% of the world's children, and yet we consume 40% of the world's toys. Why do our kids need 20 times their fair share of toys? Right? Right from the earliest age, we take and just teach them that this kind of unlimited consumption is what health and well-being and happiness is about. When I was in Peru, my wife and I were over listening to a native guide talking about at Machu Picchu. We were at the emperor's home, two rooms. And he said, you know, he always gets amazed. Americans come in and he asks them, why do you have 5 homes? Why does your family need 5 homes? Well, for him, a home equals a room. And most of the homes were 1 room. And why do you need a different home for each kid? Okay? Don't you like each other? Don't you want to be together more as a family? And so we need to be thinking in terms of the way that we consume. But one of the challenges we have is, if we're going to do our best science, we need to get a consensus. When we talk about reducing, how much? Okay, how much? So let's take and apply that reducing to these 4 health behaviors. We know how much the average smoker needs to reduce in order to get to a much more sustainable, healthy lifestyle. And that's about a pack of cigarettes a day. And we now know that we can help within a year 40% of smokers to quit smoking, okay? With relatively low-cost kinds of interventions. Now, if we want to look in terms of from an equity perspective, we know that smoking is disproportionately part of lifestyles in terms of folks with lower incomes. It's part of it in terms of ways of coping with distress. It's also clearly part of marketing. We know that about almost half of all cigarettes are smoked by smokers with mental illness. And yet, until recently, there were no evidence-based programs for smokers with mental illness. But look at what we could do. In Rhode Island, if we helped these smokers, 40% to quit smoking, that would give them about $2,500 in discretionary income. If we did that on a national basis, that would save employers about $18 billion a year. It would save smokers about $10 billion a year. See where we're going? We can go, and it is reducing consumption, okay? Significantly reducing consumption. And so we need to be looking in terms of how in some areas we can be saying to folks, listen, let's work together to reduce, okay? To reduce your consumption. And so by reducing your consumption of cigarettes, not only are you enhancing your own health, but you can be enhancing your environment as well. How about with alcohol? How much do people need to reduce in order to get to a more sustainable, healthy lifestyle? And it turns out it's somewhere, for those who are abusing alcohol, it's somewhere between 300 and 400 beers a year. Now, some of this is very culturally specific. When we were in Scotland, a friend was presenting where they had been looking to take and do risk reduction rather than abstinence. And so they were trying to have people go from high-risk drinking to low-risk drinking. In the US, that would be for men about 14 drinks a week, max for women about 7 drinks a week. Their criteria in Scotland was to get the men to go below 50 drinks a week and the women below 35 drinks a week. And my wife said, and they were disappointed by the impact they had. Because and my wife said, well, don't you think you set your criteria way too high? And he said, well, you Americans, you know, you're American-centric in terms of your culture. So we look at other behaviors in terms of food. Now here we have some folks who clearly don't have enough calories, but when we look at the 2/3 of our population that are overweight or obese, we know on average we need to reduce by about 500 calories. Okay, we could take and translate that into the kind of cost savings that folks would have, but we also need to recognize these kind of behaviors account for about 60% of all healthcare costs. Pharmaceuticals, less than 20%, but the most widely used kinds of treatments. Now you look at this campus, right? And you see biotechnology, $60 million. You see pharmacy, $90 million. You see the cancer prevention research for its building, $2 million. What's wrong with this picture? Now, not only do we see such a big part of healthcare being consumed by these behaviors, and we know now that we have a healthcare system that is not sustainable, simply is not. We know we're going to have increasing controls over what kind of healthcare services will be delivered and allowed. And if you're wealthy, you can get away with things that otherwise other folks wouldn't be getting in terms of kinds of services. But these behaviors account for even 3 times the healthcare costs, 3 times the amount in terms of lost productivity. Kathleen was talking about in terms of issues around eating and lost productivity. And one of the things that we're faced with in terms of increasing inequity is that we have not, in spite of what we believe about the digital world, there is not good evidence that the digital revolution has actually increased our productivity. Okay? It was clear that the steam engine increased productivity. Okay? And what happened with that is increased productivity, you saw increase in wages. Okay? Same thing in terms of the combustion engine. Increased productivity, you saw increase in wages. We have not seen that kind of increase in wages with the digital revolution. What we really see is people working a heck of a lot more hours often, and often in terms of distress with it. So the point here is that we need to recognize the kinds of costs. And one of the things that I do believe we need to do is to take and look at where are people in terms of their readiness to take and change their behaviors, like the consumption behaviors. And if we're going to change behaviors, for many of us, and certainly for population generally, we start with changing our mind. We start with our mental model of what behavior change means. And we are still an action-oriented society that defines behavior change as taking action. When you quit smoking, when you quit abusing alcohol, when you start to exercise at adequate rates. And so we develop all kinds of action-oriented campaigns, and it turns out the majority of people who need to be changing behaviors, typically around 80%, are not prepared to take action. And so we end up that we put our energies in, early in the HIV and AIDS epidemic, we were called the CDC. They were frozen. They were just arguing about what to be doing to this. We said, how about a little science, all right? Let's go out and assess, where are your high-risk populations? And we found only 25% were ready to take action to prevent HIV and AIDS, but 75% of their resources at CDC were action-oriented. Okay? So a huge mismatch between the needs of the population and the kind of help that was coming. And what happens? What happens when we try to take and impose action on people who aren't ready? What we produce is reactants. And so when people see, and certainly the way that it gets construed by those who don't want changes in sustainable kind of behaviors, it's big government trying to impose this on you, right? It's somebody trying to control you and coerce you. And that really takes and speaks to the people in those earlier stages who are saying, yeah, that's right, okay? And so we need to be able to take and communicate to them, our motto is, wherever you're at, we can work with them. Whether you're ready to take action, getting ready, not ready, our programs can be of help. So let's just look at this group that historically with the zone. Those we call in pre-contemplation stage. Not ready to take action in the foreseeable future. Historically in health, we call them resistant, non-compliant, reactant, and we wrote them off. What do we know? We know that they can be in this stage out of a lack of awareness, okay? Not having adequate knowledge or education about it. And so there are millions of Americans who are couch potatoes who cannot imagine that their couch could kill them. Okay? And so we need to help them to understand. And here was the head of our health department speaking emotionally to engage these people. 30-second spot on Channel 6. Man killed by couch. Details on a 6 o'clock news. Does that get their attention? Okay, does that move them emotionally? Is she talking about facts and statistics, or is she speaking to their gut and engaging them in ways that can help them to move? Folks can also be in this stage out of demoralization. And so you have millions of Americans who have tried to lose weight too many times in too many ways. Their history says they want to change, because often we say, well, they don't really want to change. Clearly their history says they want to, but their demoralization is, are they able to? And what they attribute that to can be demoralizing. I'm very concerned, my kids and grandkids are all in California. I think California is really becoming very demoralized about the ability to solve their water problem. Right? And that can cause people to say, well, forget it, give up. Okay? And so even with impending crisis, you can have people become helpless, learn helplessness, and you become depressed about it. They want to do something, but they're stuck with where they're at. Then the other one is in terms of defense against the denial. So they deny that the problem is as bad as it is. They take and defend against information coming in that would take and change the mind. Now, we take that one principle, okay, that one simple principle, we apply it to people in free contemplation. And let me give you an example. Historically in psychology, our debate is behavior due to nature or due to nurture? Is it biological controls or is it social controls? We left out self-controls. Okay? Because self-controls was too soft. It's like personal freedom. And then my own passion was about personal freedom. And that's the freedom to be able to change your own behavior when you need to. And so in terms of folks who are, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Pick up in terms of, yes, okay. So here's a real life intervention. U.S. Air Force wants to be smoke-free. So they take and say, because, I mean, it's bad for the environment as well as bad for the individual. It has bad for the work environment in terms of productivity, increased fires, that kind of thing. So, enlisted people, 6 weeks of basic training. You have to be totally smoke-free. And they do random saliva tests to see if there's any cotinine in the body. What's the consequence? If you're found with any cotinine in the body, you have to repeat basic training. Now, you want to control behavior? I mean, 6 weeks of total abstinence. Social controls can be incredibly powerful. But they've been through 6 weeks of the worst times of relapse, the highest risk of relapse. That means they should be more likely to succeed when they come out. What's the recidivism rate 12 months later? Recidivism rate 12 months later. People guess 80%, 90%. It's more than that. Recidivism rate, 123%. What does that mean? That 23% of the enlisted people started to smoke who weren't smoking at the beginning. And we concluded that the U.S. Air Force environment was a risk to the enlisted people's health. Okay? So, one 45-minute session with people in free contemplation, okay, during basic training, they were fully intending to go back to smoking immediately as soon as basic training was over. We have worked with it in terms of raising their awareness, one 45-minute discussion about all the benefits of staying smoke-free. At 12 months later, 7,000 in the treatment group, 30,000 in the control group. Those who had that 45-minute session, one principle, raising those pros, 5 times as many stayed quit as those in the control group. So, simple principles, but can be very, very powerful. So what does that say? That says when we're communicating to those percentages who are out there in free contemplation, we need to be raising their awareness and their appreciation about the benefits of changing their consumer behavior, of the benefits of participating in more sustainable kinds of behaviors. Similarly, those in contemplation stage, typically another 40%. What they are, when we take a look at pros and cons, okay, the pros go up, but the cons are up there also. And so this group has the pros and cons tied. They are characterized by profound ambivalence. Is it worth it? Is it not? Should I keep progressing? Should I put it off? And frankly, tobacco industry, we know, spent about a decade not trying to invalidate science, just raising doubts about it. Is that happening today, about doubts about climate change, doubts in terms of the impact on the environment? And so we need to help these folks recognize that those doubts are being reinforced, and excuse me, how do we help them to take and bring down the cons while continuing to take in these pros? Now let me just say this. If we just use raw scores, how much pros of quitting smoking? What are the cons of quitting smoking? We would find in every group, the pros of quitting smoking are greater than the cons. You can't live in the US and have this be the #1 public health campaign and not be aware of that. But this is kind of tricky science. You have to take and use standardized scores, which correct for ease of responding. Much easier to endorse the pros than the cons. And what this reflects is that the decision making around these kind of behaviors is not particularly conscious. It certainly is not as rational or as empirical as we would expect. And so we need to help people to start to become aware that as they increase their awareness, start to make more conscious learning decisions, they can be. So I also want to challenge a strong belief that the big impact on smoking came with public health policies, came with increased taxation, came with bans of public smoking. The fact is that smoking peaked right around the first Surgeon General's report. The first Surgeon General's report was very clear in terms of the evidence about the risks of that, and it started a gradual 1% reduction a year in terms of the prevalence of smoking in the US. And it wasn't until half of ever smokers in the US became non-smokers that there was the support to go to much stronger policies, much increased kind of taxation. The point here is that historically, we relied on policies and incentives to change behavior because those are population-based. Historically, our kinds of programs at the individual level were just individually based. But now we have used digital technology to be able to bring individualized and interactive kind of communications to people that can take and help them to be progressing. And we can take and have this kind of individual behavior change on a population basis. And I mean, just to let you know, we're working right now with an exercise equipment company that is just so frustrated. They get like 12 million people to try their programs, and 90% discontinue quite quickly. So I think one of the things is which consumers do we take and partner with, okay, that are good for the environment and good for health? Because here's one of the things I think we're faced with. Why, I say to myself, why don't smokers just give up? I mean, we have stigmatized. We make them go out in the cold and the rain to get a cigarette. Okay? We have taxed them incredibly high. So why don't they just give up? Well, what looks like an irrational decision on the individual level, if you look at it at the social level, what would have happened in the year like 1964 with the first Surgeon General's report If we were all rational, empirical decision makers and 50 million Americans quit smoking that year, what would happen to our economy? What would happen if people took reducing their consumption of goods and protect the environment really seriously? Okay? What would happen to our economy? We are a consumer-driven economy. You look at Japan. Japan has been stuck in their economy for way too long. And why? Because they don't have consumer-driven. So I think one of the things that we need to do in terms of multidisciplinary is to be saying, what is a green economy? What is it so that we continue with consumption, but consumption that's good for the environment, consumption that is good for health, and consumption that is good for well-being as well. Because that really is the pushback. Right now, what's the biggest pushback in terms of, one of the biggest pushbacks in terms of healthcare reform? It's going to be reduced consumption of hospitals, for example. And the hospitals are running scared that they're going to be increasingly in financial kind of trouble. So we can't just say, well, we're anti-consumer behavior. We need to say, what's the alternative that could help people continue to consume, but in ways that are sustainable for the environment and sustainable for themselves. So let me just end up with this. We did a project, because I want to give you a sense, when we're talking about health, we are really talking about a World Health Organization perspective of health. It's not just physical health. It's emotional health. It's social health. It's cultural health. It's financial well-being. I mean, that's what the World Health Organization. Our society has shrunk it down to the lack of disease and the lack of risk for disease. It's basically an empty model of humanity, whereas the World Health Organization has a much fuller model of that. And what I want to point out is, we worked with a group of folks, 4,000 across the country, 40 different states, 70% overweight and obese, histories of depression, 4 chronic disease conditions, 4 health risk behaviors. We worked with them just with digital kind of communications across the country. They came in with a very rare profile as a group. In the US, you almost always have many more people thriving than struggling or suffering. That has been the profile, and it changes very little typically from year to year. But in 2008, with the crash of the economy, we went like this. Okay? We went like that. I mean, clearly, many more people struggling and suffering than were thriving. And it wasn't until about 12 months later, with $700 billion invested, that we finally got that turned around. Just to give you an example, with this population that was suffering and struggling, in a relatively brief period of time, we were able to get 70% to move to thrive. So the point is we want to be speaking to folks, what will move them? Okay? Health, we probably have driven behavior change by the construct of health, probably to its limit, at least our historical. We need to bring in sustainability as something that we drive. I remember I was on a panel with the head of human resources, a company like Google, and he said, you know, when they interviewed the young people, it used to be, what's your health benefits? Okay? He said, the first thing they want to know is, what's your environmental policy? I mean, that's the way we want to be educating our young people. When they go out for jobs, they don't ask about what your health benefits, it's what's your environmental policy. We also know that young people are going to be much more driven by how they are functioning, how they are thriving. Health is in the future, much more. And so again, we need to find the kind of constructs that can take and engage those folks and help them to be part of that kind of change process. Our ideal goal, to help many more individuals to be thriving, many more families to be thriving, many more companies to be thriving, many more communities to be thriving, and that means thriving environments, thriving cultures as well as thriving religion.
Yeah, I think I'm very thankful of all your contributions. And as Jim said, how to change into a green economy. I think that will be a long process itself. But I like very much your comment because when you look back at the history of URI, URI was founded as an agricultural school. So, and I see there are a lot of contradictions, and especially about food. I think why they are not, can URI not a pioneer for having their own grown products. So, and I think I like very much. I think all of your contributions, David. Here we was talking also about the global aspects, also about development countries. I think there's also many aspects what we can learn in terms of sustainability nowadays, and also Cheryl, I think also that's also you have spoken from my heart. The cultural component is also very important when we talk about how to change human behavior, how to change policy. I think also it's very important to reflect that we are a community. So we have to understand, we have to listen, and we have to work together. And that's maybe something which works with the concept of a green economy. Also think about how we can build a new structure, how a new degrowth economy can be established. And I have some suggestions. Students, please don't make some sticky notes for changes. What can be changed on campus? I have two suggestions. My suggestion is reduce uses of resources: energy, gas, food, paper, plastic, water, just as an example. Then second, improve cooperations with different departments, interdisciplinary courses, and a tech shop on campus. With these saved resources and cost, what we can do, for instance, we can lower tuition fees for students, and we can increase wages for part-time faculties without benefits. And I have a second proposal, establishing a best ideas lab. So students should benefit from and be awarded from their own innovative ideas.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming and attending this lecture.